Hello, everyone. I'm pleased to be here today with Jamillia Ferris, one of the leading authorities on competition issues. Jamillia provides antitrust counsel on some of the most complex acquisitions and regularly works on matters before both the FTC and the DOJ. Jamillia, hi, would you introduce yourself to all our members and tell us about your practice?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for asking me to join. I'm a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Freshfields. I spend much of my day talking about a lot of the issues that we'll be talking about today, whether it's M&A transactions and the impact of an antitrust review on those, or investigations by the antitrust agencies. And they've certainly given us a lot to talk about. I'm really happy here to also be joined by my colleague in New York, Paul Humphreys, a leading M&A advisor who I'm privileged to have a chance to work with. He obviously focuses on cross-border public and private M&A, among other complex transactions. I'll turn it over to him to introduce himself as well.
Well, thank you, Jamillia. The pleasure is all mine, both to be here today to talk about such an interesting topic, but also to work with leaders like yourself. As you mentioned, I am an M&A lawyer. I work on a range of cross-border issues and transactions, both for strategics and private equity sponsor clients. And increasingly more, Jamillia and I and our antitrust colleagues are in touch from very early stages in the deals that we work on to talk about a number of the issues that I'm sure will be surfaced in our conversation today.
Well, it's delighted to have both of you here. Both Paul and Jamillia are co-authors of the recent report, Global Antitrust in 2023, just released 10-part extensive paper that looks at some of the most important trends in antitrust, a very timely work that taps into the breadth of Freshfields, both global antitrust practice and the M&A practice across a variety of offices and jurisdictions, and brings a really unique and fresh perspective to the changes that are afoot in the antitrust landscape, and also helps us look ahead at some of the major antitrust reforms that we would expect in the months and years to come. So let's talk about some of the themes in the report. And to start us off, Jamillia, you've talked and observed in your authorship that merger control is becoming both more aggressive and less predictable. Help us bring some context to that. So how much more aggressive and how much more unpredictable?
Yeah, I guess the one thing I'd say is, after kind of saying that for the past year and a half, what is true is that antitrust enforcement has become predictably unpredictable, if that's a fair description. And that is because of the aggressive approach that the regulators are taking. One way to think about it is that the current enforcers in Washington really view themselves as kind of crusaders against consolidation generally. And that's the lens at which they look at transactions. So it used to be you'd have enforcers say, well, we want to deal with the competition problem. We're law enforcers and we are instructed by the law to address lessening of competition as a result of M&A transactions, but we're not here to kind of stop consolidation generally. And I think it's a real sea change in the sense that that is no longer the view of regulators. They really want to stop consolidation generally. That being said, deals aren't impossible. Not every deal is being blocked. In fact, it's quite a small percentage. What is unpredictable and what is different than one would have expected 2 years ago is the kinds of theories they're using to go after transactions that in some cases would have been challenged in another regime, in another era. In others cases that maybe wouldn't have been challenged because the theory is quite different and they're trying to push the boundaries of the law. As we'll talk about, in some cases they're losing as a result because the law doesn't support the theories. But that's kind of the overarching environment in which M&A is being conducted right now.
Well, I appreciate you bringing some perspective to set the stage, because I think we need to understand contextually how this environment is different as we think about better techniques to navigate through it. And I think, Paul, as you start us off, if you would, and we talk about working with acquirers at the very earliest stages of the deal, I assume you're starting to think about antitrust scrutiny at the earliest stages. And even now for the smallest deals, where historically we would have thought the competitive threat was really nascent at best. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, look, there have always been deals where there were significant overlaps, and I think it's an obvious item on the kickoff agenda to talk about risk allocation and potential remedies. And so those deals, they're the obvious ones. It's the normal playbook, not the normal playbook, certainly for how the agencies are approached and particularly how remedies are approached, but certainly that's a part of the early conversation. I do think that clients are sometimes taken aback when, particularly clients who maybe are not serial acquirers, and are potentially investing in a new technology or thinking about vertical integration where the overlaps are not obvious. And when I put on the agenda on the kickoff call that I want to start off talking about antitrust, or I bring Jamillia to the call, they kind of wonder, why do we have this antitrust lawyer here? You know, nothing to see here. And so I think the thing that is most surprising for certain parties is what Jamillia just laid out, that there is a new way of thinking and theories that get airtime that just haven't in the recent past. And so what are we talking about at that earliest stage, even for deals that are smaller or are going to get done? I think the first thing we talk about is document creation. And what are you saying in the types of documents, decks that go to your board that talk about the deal, that talk about the market, that talk about pricing, and a number of things that when they're going before the board are obvious things that you want to talk about, but when you put it in front of a regulator in this environment, it can create some really uncomfortable conversations, even for deals that are ultimately going to get done. So we talk a lot about that. We also, even in the easier deals, I think, try to get parties to really engage with counsel for the other side, or in an auction, even with multiple parties, sometimes before bids are due, to really scan the horizon and see if there's something just non-obvious that the parties may be missing that might lead to either an increased timeline to get merger clearance through, to get antitrust clearance, or actually might lead to some form of remedy or a conversation with regulators around something a bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think that helps us think about better processes. And one of the focuses of the Institute is, of course, better processes lead to better results. And so I think it's important to widen our lens and understand that at the earliest stages. Jamillia, help us as well think, if you would, about what I've heard called the post-consumer welfare era of antitrust regulation. And you think it's important that our members are really particularly focused on labor issues? It seems that compensation, that non-competes, that's getting a lot of the attention. Is that really where we should focus?
It is absolutely an area to focus on. I think it's an example, the FTC's recent issuance of a proposed rulemaking to ban all non-competes. It is, setting aside that actual issue where there's a lot to talk about, what it is a signal of is that these regulators absolutely are going to find ways to implement the policies that they announced at the outset of the Biden administration. They have been talking about labor issues and non-competes for some time, and here they're showing that they're actually going to try to do something about it. So when they say they care about labor issues, and in the post-consumer welfare world, where they say they're concerned about more than just the direct impact on competition, I think you can take them at their word, and you're seeing it play out in their deals. So the one litigation that the agencies won last year was the Penguin deal, where the whole theory of that case was protecting authors. And when you think about it, it was authors who get higher than $250,000 in advance. And, one might think those aren't the most sympathetic workers. They're not really who they're talking about, because those, of course, are the most successful authors who probably have some leverage. But the point of the litigation, the bigger picture, and something they will be talking about forever, is not that they protected these specific authors like Stephen King, but rather that it shows that antitrust can be used as a tool to be protecting workers more broadly. And I think in all of your deals, you need to take a step back and think, what is the labor story here? It's not always going to be an issue. That's the one case that was challenged there, but you are going to get questions, and you are going to want to understand what the story is as your deal affects workers.
And again, Paul, as we think about structuring deals, and you think about this scrutiny around labor issues, there's a lot of talk about trying to fix it first, right? It sounds simple, but also being mindful the agencies have a lot of skepticism around behavioral remedies and structural remedies. And, what is your thinking now in terms of how to anticipate and fix it first as it relates to some of these labor issues?
Yeah, so when we talk about fix it first, we're talking about trying to divest the problem and basically go into the regulators with clean hands and say, there's nothing to see here. The overlaps don't exist anymore. So on fix it first, I think there are kind of two issues to think about. One are the things that Jamillia just laid out. The fix it first strategy might get rid of the overlap, but it doesn't necessarily fix the wage issue. In fact, you couldn't really, as an antitrust matter, collude to fix the wage issue. And so I think the word of caution around fix it first is you really do need to take a step back and understand, as Jamillia said, the wage story, but also what are the other theories that are getting a lot of airtime in DC today, where people are willing, regulators are willing to use antitrust as a tool to try to address a number of societal issues, whether it's racial equity, whether it's wage issues, access to technology, whatever the theory of the day is, because fix it first may not be the right strategy for those particular issues. That being said, fix it first certainly is a strategy that we talk to all of our clients about when there are obvious overlaps, when there's an obvious issue, when there's an obvious problem that will need to be addressed through some form of what we think of as traditional remedies. And why would you do that? Well, ultimately, it makes the discussion with the regulators much easier. It should, in theory, decrease the amount of time. You are taking more time before you put your filing in, whether that's 30 days, 60 days, whatever, and your merger agreement is going to provide for what that timeline looks like. But the parties will understand and engage in a process to divest whatever needs to be, quote, fixed. And then you go into the regulator, and certainly even where you have issues around these theories around wage or whatever the other theory will be at the time that you go in to discuss it, you have still taken off of the table the issue that is a true antitrust competition issue. So it does make the conversation easier, even where you still have these other more novel theories to address.
Well, Jim, I wonder if you could layer on top of some of the guidance that Paul's just shared in terms of thinking about this from an industry perspective, right? So are there sensitivities in technology and life sciences in particular that one should be aware of, and so think about solutions differently depending on whether they're in a target industry or whether they're in an industry that's avoided some of the current scrutiny?
Well, I'm going to start with your second question, because really, in some ways, those areas that have not been the clear focus of the rhetoric, those sometimes have the deals that are easier to fix, because you might be talking about a particular product or product line, in spite of the fact there's, this doorknob merger litigation that's pending right now in federal court, and it's around divestiture of the high-end doorknobs and whether or not that's sufficient. It's actually a really good read, the court's recent some of the filings, because it'll give you an insight into what the agencies look at when they're thinking about divestitures and how they actually view the M&A transaction quite differently than industry. Some of the things they worry about in the context of that divestiture negotiation, I think would be quite surprising for people who do deals all the time, because it's different. They seem sort of alarmed that there's a transition services agreement in a divestiture, which I don't think would be surprising to anybody who's trying to sell a business. So I think it's important to be aware of the regulators looking at things somehow differently than, people who do deals all the time. That's one piece. But it is true, going back to your original question, that outside of technology, it's sometimes easier to vest, because in the tech sector, your technology, it's the rare case that you will have sort of siloed technology that would be easy to divest. It's probably all embedded. It happens, but it's the more rare case. I think it's often easier to address overlap concerns outside of the tech space. So then you have to kind of think creatively as to whether there's a license or some other kind of remedy that the regulators might not like and might not sign off on. But if you ultimately think you're willing to fight it out in court, the courts might think that that divestiture is sufficient. And we've seen that in deals that have been litigated.
That's really interesting. And I think let's build on that a bit as well, Paul, because I think in addition to a lot of the work that you do with public companies on deals, you also guide a number of financial sponsors on their transactions. And I'm curious in your thoughts on whether the dynamics that Jamillia has just described are also relevant for private equity deals, both for the deals and also thinking about this overall sort of management and governance of their portfolios.
Certainly relevant for private equity. I think there is a bit of curiosity in DC around private equity, and probably a misunderstanding of actually how private equity functions. I think that there is a little bit of a they're the bad guy, and we have to watch out for private equity because we don't understand them. And actually, I think private equity can do a lot to enhance competition and to keep businesses that would otherwise not find a home afloat. But what does that mean both for kind of their ongoing portfolio maintenance and governance, and what does it mean in the context of deals? I think, I'll go back to a point I made earlier around documents. Document hygiene among sponsors sometimes is very poor. If you have to put your deck of a roll-up strategy in front of a regulator that has literally laid out, here is the next target and the next target and the next target, you're going to have some very uncomfortable conversations in this environment. And I think that sometimes takes sponsors by surprise. In addition, we've started to see enforcement around overlapping directorates. And so, having directors on boards of competitors where you have multiple portfolio companies under one fund. So that's something that we're talking to clients about. And then, on the preparation for sale processes for private equity, really making sure people understand the enforcement outside of the merger control context, but just in how you set up a data room and making sure that you understand when clean teams are really required. These are things that I think we think about with strategics on a very regular basis, but for sponsors where deals are happening much more regularly at a much faster pace often, these are the types of things that maybe don't get discussed as early and as often. And so it's really around hygiene and process, I think, both in the context of governance, but also in the context of doing deals.
Paul, let me follow up too and flip us to the sell side just quickly, because we used to think of financial sponsors as a great solution for divestitures that sometimes were driven by antitrust. Is the appeal for private equity to be a counterparty on that side diminished now?
So I think the skepticism of private equity as a divestiture taker has existed outside of the US for some time. And I think that has started to seep into the US regulatory mindset. I don't think that it will discourage private equity for signing up to and trying to pursue divestiture targets. I think that the sponsors who will be most successful in those processes are the ones who have a very clear, not just a story, but can show in deal documents, in the conversations, in who's hanging around for management, how the business will be sustained. And particularly in carve-out scenarios where there is not the entire back office and support structure that would exist in another strategic, demonstrating how you're going to backfill that entire architecture will be very important to showing the regulators that as a private equity fund, this is not just a business that you're going to take a lot of cash out of and 5 years from now won't exist. It's actually a sustainable business and business model.
I think that's really helpful to think about as well. And I love that we're drilling into some of the mechanics. I think in that same vein, Jamillia, help us, if you would, also consider the impact of this shifting environment on what we might call quasi-M&A structures. Certainly joint ventures come to mind right away. Are we seeing the same level of scrutiny and the same challenges for deal makers there?
I think you need to approach those with the same care, right? It's not every JV or quasi-M&A structure that will require regulatory approval before you can proceed. And in fact, many do not. So there, I think you need to just be careful in terms of how you structure it for information sharing purposes. What is the nature of the ongoing competition and relationship? And make sure you have kind of clear lines and clear boundaries for what is acceptable and not acceptable for the antitrust laws, even where you don't have a filing, and particularly where there'll be continued competition between the members of the JV.
Yeah, I think that's helpful too, because we always talk about not just acquisitions, but obviously JVs and other, like I said, quasi-M&A transactions. And so it's important to think about those as well. And all of this is taking more time. What we also, I think, are struck by is the slowed pace from signing to close. And that introduces a variety of new issues and risks. Paul, what are some of the issues that you're thinking about in particular on these long or slow to close deal cycles?
Yeah, so I kind of put it in two buckets. There's the regulatory efforts covenant, and then there's everything else in the contract that's impacted by a long timeline. We're seeing 24 months, 18 months as long stop dates in merger agreements now for deals that have a lot of hair on it. That is a long time to have to operate a business under an interim operating covenant or an interim operating set of provisions. For the efforts covenant, to go back to that for a second, I think one of the things that's very important is obviously to make sure you have the amount of time built into the merger agreement to do whatever you're committing to do as the acquirer. So if you're saying we will commit to do everything under the sun, including litigate, making sure that you understand what that means is a timing matter. And most of the deals that have this kind of timeline on them aren't just making filings in the US. There's a global element to it. And so making sure that the timelines throughout the world actually all line up, because even if you could get through the US in 9 months, a year, are you going to get through the European Commission in that amount of time? So that's on the efforts covenant. I think the other provisions that get a lot more of attention where you have these longer deal timelines. The obvious one, which I already referenced, is the interim operating covenant. So all of the provisions that say what thou shalt and shall not do in between signing and closing. And when you put that up against the backdrop of a global pandemic, which we've just come out of, or a potential recession, or whatever the next world event is, making sure that as a target, you have the flexibility to do the types of things that you might need to do to make sure that you're putting buyers on notice that you can't take a month to decide whether I can do X, Y, or Z. You know, you have to have a timeline and an ability to come back and say yes or no, so I know how I can continue to run my business in this long process. I think the other provisions that are getting a lot of attention, certainly in LBOs, making sure that debt commitments are going to remain outstanding for the amount of time that it may take to close the transaction. And then an interesting feature, I think, of the private M&A market, as most people will know, in most private M&A transactions, rep and warranty insurance has now become the way that parties allocate risk of breaches of representations and warranties. And so on deals that have longer tails, it's really important to understand what the policy says about how long the time between signing and closing can be, and are there features of the policy that may fall away at certain time points if the deal hasn't closed. So for example, a number of policies, if not most, provide for something like a materiality scrape. Well, once you hit 1 year, is that going to fall away? And so really lining up all of the pieces with the insurance, with the financing, and then of course the interim operating covenant to make sure that none of the rights that you have fall away at some point between day one and 24 or 18, whatever months your closing date is very important.
Well, I think that really helps expand our imagination, if you will, of some of the rippling effects that these delays have. And so I'm really happy that we're starting to unpack some of these considerations, because it's just not perhaps standard process and practice anymore to think that you're going to get a deal done as quickly as you used to. So, but with that said, Jamillia, help us think about this from a pragmatic perspective as well. So, I think I saw recently HSR filings up 50%. There's some 3,000 a year. And obviously it ebbs and flows, but there's a lot of filings. Do the agencies have the capacity to really drill into these transactions at a level of depth? And, or if they're putting together good documents and a good process, are most deals getting through?
Yeah, I mean, even if you take aside the sort of aggressive nature of antitrust, most deals don't actually raise big antitrust issues. So if you look at the statistics over time, the agencies actually haven't issued a report disclosing the number of second requests, that is in-depth review, that they do since 2020. But prior to that, it was always about 2 to 3% and about 44 to 54 second requests a year. Maybe there's a few more than there used to be, but I can't imagine, given capacity constraints, that's like a significant jump in percentages of deals that are getting in-depth inquiries. So most deals don't get them. And if you look at the deals that have been challenged, that's sort of what I mean when I say they've been predictably unpredictable. All of them have the hallmarks of deals that would be challenged in the current environment. So I think if you run a process where you really analyze the risk, it will tell you a lot more about whether or not your deal has the hallmark of risk that you're likely to get an investigation. And then the question becomes, well, are you actually going to be challenged? And there again, while some of the cases really are different than what you've seen in the past, there's still numerically not so many more. There were like 10 in the last year. There's certainly fewer deals that have been remedied that you see for all the reasons that Paul discussed before, the skepticism around remedies and consents. There are fewer of those, but actual challenges, the numbers you haven't seen sort of a huge swing in numbers. So I think the lesson here is really thinking about, does your deal have the hallmarks of one that will be investigated? And then what is your strategy for getting that deal through, thinking not only about the US, but the global strategy? And that's what I mean. Deals are not impossible, but they do have more hair on them.
Well, you've piqued our interest, I think, but actually only scratched the surface on some of the complexity that deal makers face. And as we think about these challenges in the year ahead, I think this has been already a constructive and good conversation. But to build on it, we're going to pass along a link to the full report. Closing thought, a particular chapter that you think we should spend extra time on, or any other areas that you want to highlight from the report?
I couldn't pick a favorite.
Yeah, I couldn't pick a favorite. One other thing to look out for, even for any company considering an M&A transaction that's going to be investigated, it also, as a result of all the documents you're going to produce, the agency gets a lot of insight into your company's activities. And another space where they're investing resources is just investigations in general, in conduct. So you want to make sure you have good compliance policies in place and are thinking about the myriad of other issues regulators are looking at even before you do a deal.
That sounds great. And I think with that, let me wrap us up here and suggest everybody take a good look at this report, Antitrust, Global Antitrust Considerations for 2023. And thank you, Jamillia and Paul, for helping unpack some of the issues of the report. I think it's a great read, and I really encourage our members to dive into that and get ahead of it as they think about M&A in the new year. Thanks again for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.